This time I'm going to represent Wild Europe because I mentioned yesterday that I work, or I'm president of the Great Lakes and Wetlands Association, but that's a voluntary work, and I obviously have to pay my bills, and Wild Europe pays my bills. So I work for Wild Europe and some other organization as well. So what I'm going to, my colleague Toby Aykroyd was supposed to talk about this, but unfortunately he had to cancel due to a project that we do on Renewable Energy Directive, so I will try to replace him as much as possible. So we try, what we argue for several years now, that wilderness should be brought back to Europe. The basis of this presentation is basically, I'm going to talk about the definition of wilderness, what Wild Europe is, how we worked with EU institutions in the past, how the wilderness concept relates to the current EU biodiversity strategy, and what the nature restoration law could bring, and what's the freshwater situation. And I will link it to Gábor's speech about some of the benefits of wilderness and wilderness freshwater habitats, with some examples. The organization is called Wild Europe Stichting. It's a foundation registered in the Netherlands, and we almost have 2 decades of working together as a network organization. Our special focus is on forest, wilderness, and rewilding. That's how it's linked to Arthur's speech, because I'm also a member of the rewilding thematic group of IUCN. And this, the way how we would like to bring back wilderness, which disappeared largely in Europe, is through rewilding. So we use rewilding as a tool in several places. But what wilderness is, a lot of people would argue that it doesn't exist in Europe. And so is it possible to actually re-establish wilderness? We say that yes, it's possible, because wilderness is an area governed by natural processes. So basically, if we leave an area for natural processes, we can recreate wilderness, we can bring wilderness back. That's how we use rewilding. Obviously, there are 2 various ways. It could be passive rewilding, where we just let nature to do its own work and to come back. And then there could be active rewilding. We saw some example in Arthur's presentation when machinery is actually used to bring back natural hydromorphology, for instance, and or we remove certain species from the landscape, or we bring back certain species to the landscape through active reintroduction, like we did it in Hungary with beaver, for instance, or as they do it in the Carpathian with bison reintroduction. There is, though, the way how we see rewilding is that it's actually a process, and it's a whole spectrum. Obviously, we are not able to reach wilderness very quickly, so we move from a wild landscape where the predominance is natural processes and natural habitats, but they tend to be at the beginning small or fragmented. This is where, again, I'd like to refer back to what Arthur said about the scale. We say that a wilderness area should be about 10,000 hectares in order to be considered really as a wilderness area where natural processes can govern. Wild areas could be smaller, but then sooner or later they could be moved through buffer zones and connectivity. They could move from a fragmented landscape to a true wilderness areas. As I mentioned, we are part of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management as the CEM, sorry for the abbreviation. We are part of the rewilding thematic group, and basically rewilding is a process of rebuilding natural processes following a major human disturbance. And we are also restoring then complete or near complete food web system. So that means that we eventually would like to see predators as well at the landscape. So wolf or brown bear would come back as well in the landscape, but there would be vultures as well. So scavengers and predators and grazers, they would all be together in the landscape. It happens somehow also in Hungary. I mean, golden jackal is coming back, and now wolf is coming back in Hungary. Brown bear is coming back from Slovakia. So eventually it happens naturally as well. But in order to secure that these wildlife comeback remains, we need to have strict protection, and that's how our work relates to EU biodiversity strategy. We started the work in 2008 in Abruzzo. We organized the so-called VIP trip to some of the decision makers, like members of European Parliament and representatives of the European Commission, and some national representative, like the Czech Minister of Environment, for instance. We wanted to show them that wilderness is possible even in a highly cultural landscape. Like most people would think that Italy is a cultural landscape, but they have actually pretty large wilderness areas. That VIP trip actually resulted in a European Parliament resolution in 2009 on wilderness. The Hungarian angle in this resolution was actually pushed through by Gyula Hegyi, who at that time was a member of the European Parliament. I think he was in the SD fraction in the Socialist Party group. Then in 2013, following up this resolution, the European Union, the Commission actually contracted a consortium to create a wilderness register, and later on a technical report on wilderness and Natura 2000 sites. We don't argue that every Natura 2000 site should be a wilderness area, but we need to have wilderness areas within the Natura 2000 network. And then at the end, that's probably 13 years of work. In 2021, the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 finally included strict protection and non-intervention, which we consider as wilderness. So currently, the EU commitment to have 10% of the land and the marine areas as strictly protected areas by 2030. And that would mean basically, in our interpretation, wilderness, because in these areas, the intervention, for instance, removing timber or hunting, they would be either completely forbidden or highly, highly limited. So 2030, currently in Hungary we have, I don't know, something like 2, maybe 1.5% strict protection, maybe even less. And some of the countries argues that strict protection could mean mowing or could mean grazing with domestic animals. So if that interpretation of strict protection would go through, Hungary could actually fulfill the criteria already. Anyway, this biodiversity strategy of the EU is linked to the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. There is the new Global Biodiversity Framework, which also argues that 30% of the land and marine area has to be protected by 2030. The addition to the CBD is this 10% strict protection, which would mean every habitat type, including freshwater, there should be strictly protected areas. And the EU also committed itself to have 25,000 kilometer free-flowing rivers by 2030, which I think it's actually quite ambitious. In terms of lakes, which we do with Great Lakes, probably this strict protection is even more ambitious, because we know that most of our lakes are currently under huge pressure of tourist development and property development. The strategy obviously is a political commitment, so it's hard to enforce legally because it's not a law, it's not a binding legislation, but we have the nature directives, the Habitat and the Bird Directive, the Water Framework Directive, and the Nature Restoration Law, which are binding, and through the Nature Restoration Law we can actually do some true enforcement. There was a very challenging adoption process. I don't know whether you know, but Hungary had a very interesting role in adopting the Nature Restoration Law. We were supporters, and then in the last minute in March, we actually changed our position. We became, one of the countries that refused the Nature Restoration Law. So then the whole new legislation was in a limbo in a way. At the end, thanks to Austria, the Minister of Environment who changed her position, or she changed her position in the last minute. Finally, the law went through the council, and since about a month, almost exactly a month, 18th of August, this nature restoration law is actually could be enforced, and the member states will have to work on their national restoration plans. I'm kind of confused about the percentages, but either 20 or 30%. The CBD talks about 30% restoration need of degraded habitat. But yesterday I asked Paul about the investment. I found another figure which says €1 investment in nature brings €30 benefit. Yesterday we heard 8. Even if it's 8, it's actually quite a good investment. I don't think there is any financial investment like bonds or whatever that would bring that much of a benefit based on €1 investment. I mentioned already yesterday this 84% of wetland habitat loss, and just in order to make sure I'm not lying, I looked up the source. It's Flue Chouinard et al. They published it in 2023, and basically, this is one of the figures that they have in their publication, and you see that the countries of freshwater habitat loss, Hungary is here, only Ireland is worse from the countries that were analyzed. So Ireland lost a lot of peatland, and then peatland regions are separated. Northern Europe lost a lot of peatland, and if you see the river basins, Danube is actually the second worst in terms of freshwater habitat loss. In order to implement the nature restoration law, there are broad types of enabling measures, financing from the EU and member states. Yesterday we heard already that maybe even the common agriculture policy should be updated and guarantee that we can recharge landscape with water. There are monitoring and reporting requirements as well for the member states. The financing could also involve actually private sources. Though how much this could cover, I'm not 100% sure. I'm not necessarily a big supporter of, for instance, the companies compensating their negative impact through restoration, because that would discourage them to actually minimize their impact. They can get more profit and then invest the profit in net zero, so to say. And public participation is a key in the enabling measure. And yes, this should even be done in Hungary. We are not really good, I think, currently in public participation. Most of the public consultations, for instance, on new legislation are actually either very short or very limited and not really advertised by the government. The national restoration plans should be established, I think, 2 years after the legislation is in force. That means that first a national strategy has to be prepared in a draft version through public consultation and involving science and civil society organizations. And then the draft plan is going to be sent to the Commission, and the Commission send some comments back, and based on the comments, the countries will have to finalize their restoration plans. This means that around 2026 we will have final restoration plans, probably at the end of 2026. I put here the restoration objectives. I just wanted to quote, use an example from our Minister of Agriculture, who said last December that in Hungary we have already restored 300,000 hectares of nature, and when I asked him in the framework of Freedom of Information Act, okay, could you point out where this 300,000 hectare is? Because later on this was also used during the negotiation about the nature restoration law. Then I just received back a link to the Széchenyi program that I can check the database. So basically every single penny, I guess that the government spend on national parks, including the FERTÖ investment. They probably consider it as a restoration and or as an impact on restoration. So this 300,000 hectare of restored nature, I think it's really a fake number. I would also ask what the natural state means. Is it natural 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? That was not really clearly defined. Anyway, so there is a bit of a blur information here in Hungary about how much we have already done. The benefits and co-benefits associated to restoration targets, the financing of the cost should be linked to measures according to the law, and the law also includes that no further deterioration should happen of existing habitats. That means also existing freshwater habitats. So again, that's a kind of strong argument about the net zero kind of compensatory measures. And I think the monitoring and the reporting could be strengthened also through citizen science and maybe input. There was one example I think it was last week. I attended a meeting when the HUNREN, the Ecological Research Institute, did a presentation of their water monitoring, water-related monitoring. And one interesting example was the mosquito monitoring in Hungary, which I really liked. I also participated in it as a citizen. I had to collect for a week samples of mosquitoes in my own garden, and then they were collecting it, and then they are actually measuring it, looking at the viruses and all different kind of diseases that are spread through migratory species as well. And there should be a regular review of national plan, obviously, towards 2030, 2040, and 2050. So for each of the decade, there are regular or concrete plans what the countries should deliver. What are the benefits? And that's the link to the previous speaker, Gabor. There is a clear climate change mitigation benefit from freshwater wilderness carbon storage and carbon sequestration. And I'm really looking forward to the next two speakers in the next session, because again, I have an interest in the FERTÖ Lake and the Hanság region, but peatland could actually store a lot of carbon, and peatland restoration can help increasing the carbon removal from the atmosphere. I have seen a research done by Kine in Canada, which actually said that peatlands store much more carbon than primary forests. So actually, I think here in Hungary we have a good opportunity to increase the carbon removal and carbon sequestration in the land sector through the nature restoration law. Then the water retention, like flash rains that we expect in the coming days, and the cooling effect in urban, or reduce the urban heat island impact, I think very clear benefits of freshwater habitats. Flood mitigation and other hydrological services are key. Again, just referring what is going to happen in Austria, or what we expect happening in Austria in the coming days. About 250 millimeters of rain, or maybe even 300 millimeters in a couple of days, and a sudden flood after a huge drought. So freshwater wilderness areas can actually help to reduce the impact of these sudden floods. And these services we think might attract significant funding as well, because a downhill municipality might be able to pay for uphill municipality to actually increase wilderness areas. And other benefits include cultural, recreational, fish stock. We saw in Gabor's presentation the fish stock as one of the positive added value of mangrove forest, clean drinking water, and the opportunity for future generation. And again, linking back to the Hungarian fundamental law yesterday, Nora did a presentation. Our fundamental law, Article P, refers to the rights of future generation, or actually our obligation to protect biodiversity and cultural heritage for the sake of future generation. I think that's a very important element here, especially in Hungary. Some of the Central European examples, and then I will finish, I think, with 2 slides. The drought in 2022 and 2024 showed that we have an increasing challenge in the Carpathian Basin, and especially in Hungary. In the Danube and Tisza River, there is a massive potential for restoration. Yesterday, again, Péter Kajner from WWF Hungary showed their project in the Tisza River in the Bodrogzug area, which could be a really good example of nature restoration and even creating or recreating wilderness. I hope to hear more about the Fertő and Izidles, there's Évinkel, but I think there is a good potential to establish peatland and recreate the symbiosis between human and nature, which actually resulted in in getting the UNESCO World Heritage status for the area. So that could be, again, a very positive example. Good examples also to threats in Polysia, which is an area shared between Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, was a few years ago threatened by the E40 waterway that was planning to link the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. That would have been a disaster because it went also through the Chernobyl closed zone. I was working on that. I was actually shocked that there are still plans to build this kind of waterway, ignoring alien species and the threat of invasive species, and again the threat of dredging in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. That was outstanding, really stupid, actually. Then the Western Balkan, we have huge problems of hydropower, and apparently it looks as Hungary is among the countries that are financing some of the Western Balkan countries, and probably our money is going to be spent, the money that we lend from somewhere, is going to be a threat to to biodiversity. And obviously in Western Europe yesterday heard about the pollution problems. And my last slide, I guess, is that I'd like to refer back to the Mario Draghi report about competitiveness that was launched a few days ago on the 9th of September. I think that there is no competitiveness of industry without healthy freshwater habitats, and the competitiveness should not override the EU Green Deal. I think that should be a very clear message. I think the Draghi report is still based on a very traditional way of thinking about economy. And unfortunately, it looks as Hungary is supporting this kind of way, because in our current list of priorities or program for the EU presidency, competitiveness, as I said, is mentioned 58 times. Freshwater only mentioned 3 times in our program. So I think we need to speak up against that. Thank you.